Hello, and thank you for joining us for Federal Emergency Funds Overview. This morning, we're joined by Jill Briggs-Campbell from the Vermont Agency of Education, and she is the COVID-19 Federal Emergency Funds Project Manager, and also Sandra Cameron from the VSBA. She's our Director of Public Policy, and I'm Sue Siglowski, the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. At this point, Sandra and I will go off camera so that Jill can provide her presentation, and I'll hand it over to you, Jill.
All right. Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Sandra, for having me. So I was asked by the School Boards Association to give this presentation. As many of you know, there are several, is an understatement, COVID-19 federal emergency funding programs. Currently, the Agency of Education is running or is about to run or is in the process of running 14 different grants and funding programs. And in addition, there's a variety of other programs. So Sue and Sandra thought it would be helpful for me to come and speak to all of you and give you sort of a very high-level overview of all of the different programs, some of the requirements and restrictions and timeframes around those, and then to have an opportunity for Sue and Sandra to ask some questions that may be helpful to all of you in sort of your decision-making and conversations with your schools and communities and families. So that said, I'm going to dive into a presentation here, and we'll have a moment to pause here and there to ask questions. So this is the COVID-19 Federal Emergency Funds Overview. And while many of you may already be aware of many of these programs, I'm going to start way back in March of last year and sort of do a sort of introduction to what are the major relief bills that have generated these funding programs. So going all the way back to March 27th of last year, we had the CARES Act, and many of you are probably familiar with the CARES Act already. It has sometimes been conflated with the CRF, or Coronavirus Relief Fund, but in the Agency of Education, that's just one of 3 different programs that we've been involved with. So this has included, and there is an alphabet soup here. I will be breaking these acronyms down. So bear with me for a couple of slides. But this has included for the Agency of Education ESSER Fund, which you may have heard of. This is kind of the main one for our school, our SUs and SDs, our school districts and supervisory unions. And you'll also hear me say LEAs, that's sort of the federal language. So those are interchangeable. The GEAR Fund, and then the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or CRF Fund. In December of last year, December 27th, there was a second major COVID relief bill. This one we call the CARISA because otherwise it's a mouthful. And this included ESSER 2, GEAR 2, a new program called GEAR EANS. Again, I will break all of these acronyms down. An extension of the CRF program, and then some additional child nutrition programs. And then finally, in March of this year, we've had the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, or ARP. It includes what the federal government is calling ARP ESSER. We are calling it ESSER 3 for our own sanity, but you'll hear both of those used, ARP ESSER or ESSER 3. GEAR EANS 2 or ARP EANS, just to make it more complicated, and then a supplement to our IDEA funding program. So I'll talk about those when we get to that particular bill. So for me, it has been helpful to think of these as a family tree because most of these programs are very close cousins. And so if you sort of understand one of them, you've probably got a good understanding of the subsequent programs. So in the CARES Act, ESSER is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. This, as I said, is a program that goes directly to the LEAs, our SUs, SDs, and to the Agency of Education. It's funded through the U.S. Department of Education, and this is important Most of our programs do come from the US Department of Education, but the exception to that has been the CRF fund, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And that came through Treasury, and that was significant in the kinds of regulations and requirements that were around that particular fund. So returning to ESSER, the initial ESSER program, ESSER 1, as we've come to call it, was about $31 million. And I will talk about how this program works in a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. But there's sort of two main components to all of the ESSER programs. The first is the 90% of the funds that go directly to the SUs and SDs, straight to the LEAs. And then there's also what's called the SEA set aside, the State Education Agency, which is the Agency of Education, and that's 10%. And that's a reserve that is intended for the agency to be able to respond to needs in the field on a statewide or region-wide or multi-district level, to be able to respond strategically to those needs. ESSER has a broad range of uses. I'll talk more about those in a moment. And the first ESSER fund, ESSER 1, is a multi-year program. It goes through September 30th of 2022. So that's a bit unusual. Most of our federal programs are single year, and our districts apply for them every year. The second pot of funding in the CARES Act was the GEAR Fund, Governor's Emergency Education Relief. And what the federal government was doing here, what Congress was doing, was trying to give governors of all of the states some flexibility to respond immediately. And it's important to remember that back in March, we were very much in an emergency response disposition. And so it was this need to sort of get money out immediately. Schools were closing, staff needed to be paid. A lot of like our meal programs were being stood up very rapidly and expanded very rapidly. Custodial services maybe were expanding rapidly. So there was a real need to respond quickly. And that's sort of what the GEAR fund was intended to do, was to give governors that flexibility. For the state of Vermont, we received $4.48 million. And the governor's office identified that our CTE centers, this includes our 4 independent CTE districts, as well as the centers that are affiliated with LEAs, were falling into a funding gap. So they had similar needs to our public schools and our independent schools, but there was no funding source for them because they weren't eligible for ESSER funds. So the governor's office identified that group of educational entities as needing this assistance. Again, this has a broad range of uses. It goes through September 30th of 2022. And then the last piece, and this may be the piece that most folks are familiar with, because this was the piece, the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that went through the legislature, and it was over $1 billion. So that was a really significant amount of funding. The state legislature allocated or appropriated $103 million to Vermont pre-K through 12. And through Act 120, which was in July, and then Act 154, which was in September. The Agency of Education ended up administering 5 grants. While CRF still had a fairly broad range of uses, it was more limited than ESSER. So that's important. And it had some very sort of specific requirements. It had to be clearly COVID necessary, like a very immediate connection to COVID, no sort of 2-part distancing. It was very much intended as an emergency response. And the key factor here was that it ended on December 30th of 2020. So there was a real need to get this money out to the field very, very quickly. And I'll talk briefly about what our 5 different funding programs were. We did identify at the end of December that we had about $15 million out of that $103 million that was unused, and that was in our LEA grant. And so I'll talk about what we recommended as an agency be done with those funds. CRF was extended in the next act, which was the Carissa Act, and it was extended through December of this year, 2021. And I'll talk a little bit about how that impacted our programs or didn't. So along in December, we had Carissa. Carissa included an ESSER 2. It's important to note that while these programs are close cousins again, they are run as separate grant programs and they have to be tracked as such. So you can't sort of throw all the money into one pot and just say it's the ESSER pot. They're separate and distinct programs. Each of them has an application. Each of them has a separate grant award. And there's some slight but significant differences, and that's why they're run as separate programs. So while ESSER 1 was $31 million, ESSER 2 is $126 million. So the dollar amounts are going up here. Same broad range of uses as ESSER 1, and they specifically called out learning loss, measuring and addressing learning loss as a specific emphasis. And there's an additional year. So the tail is longer. So now we're looking at September 30th of 2023 is the end of this period of performance, as we call it, or the end of the grant program. And there was also the addition, sort of a specific call out that these funds could be used for construction and facilities projects. And U.S. Department of Education was very careful to identify that this had always been an allowable use in ESSER 1. They just had not called it out as one of the cost categories. So ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 all have facilities and construction within specific constraints. And we'll discuss that later on. But that will be an important note for folks on our School Boards Association. Carissa also included, again, the GEAR fund. There is a GEAR 2. So the first program was $4.48 million and it went to our CTE centers. The second program is an additional $1.9 million. Again, same sort of programmatic function here. But the governor's office has not yet identified the priority for these funds. And again, there's sort of a desire to identify who is falling into a funding gap. And so as programs are being identified within the legislature or within the Agency of Education, or we're getting more advice from U.S. Department of Education around some of the restrictions around funds or who can use them, we're sort of waiting to see who needs that assistance. And it can be used by institutes of higher education or pre-K or K through 12. So really these funds are very, very flexible. There is a new kid on the block with Carissa, and this is the GEAR Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, GEAR EANS. And this is to address a key difference between ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 and 3. ESSER 1 had a requirement for equitable services, and this meant that there's a federal requirement that a proportionate share, and this is very specifically identified, of ESSER 1 funds needed to go to eligible independent schools. So assistance, not cash, right? There's always a federal requirement that federal dollars not go directly to independent schools, but in consultation, school districts are required to have consultation with independent schools. Independent schools share what their needs are, and then the school district is going to provide those services or support. So that is what equitable services is. Our districts are familiar with this. They do this through Title I funding. They do a version of it through IDEA, which is for special education funding. And so this was a similar type of requirement. ESSER 2 and 3 do not have this requirement. There is no equitable services. And instead, what Congress did is they created a new program called GEAR EANS. And essentially what that did is it took the burden for equitable services that was on our school districts and supervisory unions and moved it onto the Agency of Education. So now the Agency of Education is now administering this program, which is $4.28 million for our independent schools, our eligible independent schools, which is our approved and recognized. We are currently standing this program up. It's a very new and unusual program, and a bit of a challenge for all states to sort of wrap their heads around. And so this program also goes through September 30th of 2023. And that's, again, GEAR and ESSER have been extended out an additional year. And then finally, with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the CRF, there was an extension through December of 2021. For the 5 programs that we were running in the agency, this didn't have a major impact. Our programs, with the exception of one program, ended on December 30th of 2020. The one program that we decided to extend through April of 2021 was our Child Nutrition Equipment Grant. And that was because we found that districts and other school food authorities were encountering major supply chain delays. And so because we had the option and there was still funds available, we decided to go ahead and extend that. With the $15 million in unused funds from the LEA grant that I had mentioned in the previous slide, what the AOE proposed to do was to continue the Indoor Air Quality Grant. And some of you may have heard of this. This is also known as the Efficiency Vermont Grant. I'll discuss this a little bit later and talk about the details of this program, but essentially, early on in July, the CDC had sort of identified that air quality and the movement of air was one major source of concern in terms of mitigating the spread of the coronavirus. And so the legislature stood up this program, which the agency in partnership with Efficiency Vermont ran. And it was really a first in the nation kind of program, and has really sort of, in a lot of ways, set the standard. Efficiency Vermont has been hearing from many other states about this program. So because it was so successful and Efficiency Vermont was very efficient in running it, the agency recommended that the $15 million go into that program. They still had identified unmet needs, and I'll talk about the status of that program in just a bit. Finally, we come to the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. This was passed in March 11th of 2021 under the Biden administration. This includes ESSER 3 or ARP-ESSER, again, through the US Department of Education. And we went from $31 million in ESSER 2, $126 million in ESSER, $31 million in ESSER 1, $126 million in ESSER 2. We are now up to $280 million in ESSER 3. And I just identified a typo. It should say $256 million to LEAs and $28 million in the AOE set aside. There is still a very broad range of uses. They're slightly different from ESSER 1 and ESSER 2. They changed the language just a little bit. But what is significantly different about ESSER 3 is that there are specific spending mandates. And when we come to that slide, I'll discuss those a bit more. There is also an additional, because there's no equitable services for ESSER 3, there is also additional money going into the GEAR EANS program. And the ESSER 3 goes out through September 30th of 2024. So we're talking about a grant with a very long tail at this point. And then finally, there was additional funds that have come in, over $7 million for IDEA. And so there's really an awareness that special education is one place where the education system is going to need additional support. And so we have about $6 million in Part B funding, and then an additional $1 million in Part C funding. And we are still sort of awaiting the details around that particular set of funds and if there's any restrictions on it. Okay, so recently we have been very busy. at AOE. March was a very busy month for us. So I just want to sort of give an update on where things stand. In particular around ESSER funds, but also some of our other funding programs. So on March 20th of this year, the ESSER 1 applications closed, and as of actually this morning, I checked, all but 3 have actually been approved. So, and those are just in the review process, nothing wrong with them, they're just being reviewed. And we have allocated almost all of the money in approved grant awards. We have to complete that process by April 29th. Anything that's not budgeted in an approved grant award must go back to the federal government. And this is an important thing to note, that any unused funds from ESSER that are not in their budgeted in the grant award by 1 year after the award date. So for ESSER, that was April 29th, ESSER 1, must go back to the federal government. It doesn't go into a state pot, can't be reallocated for other uses, it goes back. So this is important that our districts are really thinking about fully budgeting their allocation by the deadline. And I have the deadlines in this slide deck. On the 22nd, just 2 days later, we released the ESSER 2 application. One thing that we've really been working on, particularly as the dollar amounts have gone up and the field has sort of reached out to us and said we could use more help with this, is we're doing a lot more technical assistance and support to the field. So we have set up a series of office hours every Wednesday morning, and they'll run from starting last week all the way through May and maybe even beyond, depending on the need of the field, around ESSER 2 and recovery planning. And I'll talk a bit more about recovery planning when we get to the ESSER 2 slide. With the ESSER 2 application, we also released sort of a tranche of fiscal guidance. So the ESSER 2 fiscal guidance not only is talking about sort of how to think about strategically using ESSER 2, how to tie it to your recovery planning, but it also has a really detailed list, although not exhaustive, we'll say, a detailed list of allowable costs. So if you are having conversations as a school board with your districts or with your community or with your families, I would very much point you towards that guidance document if you want to know what the ESSER funds can be used for. And again, it's not exhaustive. The cost categories are exhaustive, but we've also provided a host of examples. So I would really point folks towards that. It's available on our website. We also released an overview memo of the American Rescue Plan Act, and we released re-released an updated version of our federal education funding planning guidance, which is a mouthful. But this is really intended to be a sort of a toolkit with a long life. We first released it in the summer, and it was built around continuity of learning and reopening schools. We've since completely overhauled it, and now it's built around recovery, the recovery plan buckets, which many of you may be aware of at this point, but these are the priorities that the state has identified that schools should be focused on in terms of what we're calling the recovery phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this recognition that Vermont is very well positioned in terms of, having almost all of its students in either a hybrid disposition or fully in person, having a very sort of well-run response when we do have positive cases in the school, sort of they're limited to pods, and that sort of thing. So we've entered into this new phase that we're calling recovery, and each district is required to submit a recovery plan. This needs to be completed by June 1st. And actually our districts are engaged in this process right now. They're doing a needs assessment. They've already built up their teams. They're going to be submitting sort of initial ideas. And within the agency, every district has a education support team within the agency that's going to be working very closely with them. And as a strategic decision, that is also the ESSER team. So those are sort of the same people are doing the recovery plan support and the ESSER support. So what this document is intended to do is that if you go into it, you have an identified need. We need to have additional support for students with disabilities who need assistive technology. You would go into this document, you would go to the table of contents, you'll find that need in there, you click on it, it will take you to that page, and it will say not only if it's allowable under ESSER and which specific categories it fits under, but all of the other federal funds that could be used. So we really see this as a strategic planning document that we want our districts to be using. We are going to be using it within the agency to help maximize our federal funds. We don't want to be leaving any money on the table. We don't want to be sending any money back to the federal government. So that was a major kind of release of fiscal guidance. The very next day, as I said, it was a busy March, we released the GEAR EANS application for our independent schools. We held our first office hours on the 31st, and we have a second office hours scheduled for the 12th. We're offering very sort of hands-on consultation and support for each independent school. And we're looking at about approximately 60 schools that are going to apply for GEAR EANS. On the same day, we also released the allocations for ESSER 3. So not the application, but the allocations so that every district knows how much money it has coming to it. And so you can follow that link, and I'll provide this slide deck for release for all of you to use. And then on the day after that, the agency received the ESSER 3 grant award. And the way that they've done this is a little bit different than in the past. We have received a partial award, 2/3 of our $280 million. And what the Department of Education is requiring is each state needs to submit an application that is outlining how they will support schools in reopening for in-person learning and supporting learning loss. So again, we feel very confident about this. They haven't released this application yet, but we're very, very well positioned to be able to respond to that. All right, so diving a little bit deeper into ESSER, and we can sort of move a little bit quickly through this because I've already signaled some of the foundational elements of these grants. Again, we have our family tree. They're all close cousins. And here's some important things to know about ESSER when you're having these discussions with your districts or your communities. These are some of the key considerations. So the allocation, this has been a confusing point for many, many folks. The allocations for LEAs, our school district, our SU and SDs, is based on Title I formulas, but it is not part of the Title I program. It's in no way connected to any of the targeting requirements of Title I. If you have schools within your district and some of them participate in Title I and some of them do not, it doesn't matter. The district can still give funds for all of the different schools. It does not have to be targeted just to Title I students. So it is based on Title I formulas, but pretty much unhinged and disconnected from any Title I requirements. It is not a competitive grant. There has also been some confusion around this. These are allocations. They are generated at the federal level and they go out to our SUs and SDs. So the agency sort of passes them through. Another key element of this is that there is no supplement, not supplant requirement. And this is different from every other federal grant program that our districts experience. And so what this means is that if a district decides to use its ESSER funds for, say, a locally funded program or personnel, or for something that usually would fall under, say, Title I or IDEA, there's no obstacle to doing that. And so we can talk a little bit about sort of the strategic use of these funds as we move further along in the presentation. There is a broad range of allowable costs as determined by federal statute. One thing to note, and I'll indicate this in the next slide, is that anything that is allowable under current federal program, so 21C, Title, IDEA, Perkins, is also allowable under ESSER. And in addition, there's 13 additional categories, and I'll show you what some of those are. So we've already talked about how these programs broke down. Again, just signaling that ESSER 1 ends September of 2022, ESSER 2, September of 2023, and ESSER 3, September of 2024. And here's a handy graph to sort of help you visualize how the numbers have been increasing. So we are now looking total at going out to our SUs and SDs, $411 million. So be really cognizant that this is sort of an unprecedented amount of funding that is available. And so we'll sort of talk about what is the agency's sort of approach and guidance and advice, frankly, around how to use this kind of funding. All right, so here's a sample of the allowable uses. And as I said, there's 14 total allowable cost categories. I will again put in a plug to go to that ESSER 2 fiscal guidance where we've really broken those down in detail. Any activities that are authorized for any of our regular federal funds. And I have a note here, an asterisk that says, watch out for MOE, meaning maintenance of effort. So one thing that districts should be aware of is that if they want to move something, a cost that usually would be covered by their federal funds, their regular federal funds, into ESSER, they need to be really careful because they still have maintenance of effort requirements for those other federal funds. So they do not want to create a situation in which they will not meet the maintenance of effort requirements for those federal funds and end up losing dollars down the line. So they could really sort of shoot themselves in the foot. And so generally speaking, if it can go into a federal fund, it should go into a federal fund. ESSER is easier to apply to, but strategically, you don't want to set yourself up to lose those federal dollars down the line. I've just sort of called out some of the major categories, but as I said, there's many, many more. So activities to address unique needs of high-risk student populations, planning for remote learning, essentially, and addressing remote learning. Educational technology, of course, is a big one. Summer learning and after-school programs. We're going to be talking more about this when we get to ESSER 3, but this is a specific category. Addressing learning loss is a specific category. Mental health services and supports, school facilities and repair. So this includes improvements to indoor air quality, HVAC systems. It also includes safe and healthy environments. And so I have some specific language in a subsequent slide. And then activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of services in our schools. This is sort of I call it the miscellaneous category. Many, many things can go into this. Things like additional payroll to pay for extra custodial services or food service, family medical leave that lapsed for several months. And so we identified with US Ed approval that like family medical leave could go into this. Child care for teachers and staff if they were, needing that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. That was a really important cost. So there's a whole range of costs here. I'm going to sort of skip this because in a lot of ways we've talked about this, but what I will sort of indicate with ESSER 1 is, again, that this was very much part of like an emergency response. And most of what we've seen go into these applications, some are starting to do some forward looking towards like summer programs for this year, which is still sort of part of the emergency response. But what we've seen a lot of is like those payroll costs, the costs of closing and going to remote learning, and then the costs associated with reopening in the fall have largely fallen into that ESSER 1 bucket. The ESSER 2 bucket, the specific call out here, again, is the no equitable services, and then a specific emphasis on measuring and addressing learning loss. The Agency of Education doesn't really care for the term learning loss, but that is what's used in the federal language over and over again, so you'll see it appear here. We have other ways that we sort of frame this, partly because we do not yet know, we're doing the needs assessment around incomplete learning is another way to think about it. Maybe learning loss, but maybe also learning gains. We don't really know what the landscape is at this point. So I'm just adding some nuance there because I think the secretary and deputy secretary would want me to. And then the key thing for ESSER 2 is that in agency guidance, we are tying ESSER 2 funds to recovery planning. And I will just say there's no requirement. Districts are not required to use their ESSER 2 funds for recovery planning. But these two requirements, the ESSER 2 application and the recovery plan application, are very much going in lockstep in terms of the time frame. And so there's a certain sort of strategic logic to using the ESSER 2 to pay for the recovery planning. And again, I've identified the buckets for recovery planning: social and emotional functioning, mental health and well-being, student engagement, and academic achievement and success. And I will also signal for folks that the Agency of Education is very, very much involved in conversations with other agencies, Department of Mental Health, DCF, Children and Families. We're talking to other external stakeholders and partners, providers of summer programs and after school programs, to try to help support, not just at the district level, but at regional level and a statewide level, the work of doing recovery planning. So this is something we're very much engaged in right now, and we're in contact with the districts about this. And then finally, with ESSER 3, we have that really big bucket of money, $285 million. It's using the same allocation formula based on the Title I, no equitable services, goes out to September of 2024. So really, we can do some long-term planning here. And we are really thinking about this at the agency as using these funds, these sort of once in a lifetime funding opportunity, to look at big systemic issues. What are the big intractable problems that you've never been able to kind of tackle? ESSER 3 does have specific spending mandates, and luckily they sort of align with what our priorities would be anyways. So for SUs and SDs, the specific spending mandate is that 20% in total, that's 51 million of the 256 million, must be set aside for activities to address learning loss through evidence-based interventions. And then they call out examples. This is not exhaustive, but some examples: summer learning, summer enrichment, extended day, extended year, after school programs. But many, many, many activities can fall into this kind of learning loss bucket. Also, school districts within 30 days of receiving funds, so that would be an approved application, and we haven't even released the application yet, must make publicly available on a website a plan for the safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services. We, again, are very well positioned for this. There are many states where they've never been in person. They, don't really have a plan for in-person. We are considering, and this is not a decision point, whether or not the recovery plan can sort of serve double duty here and not sort of have districts have to create more work here. But we don't really have a lot of concerns about this particular requirement. And then there's some specific language that I'm not going to dive way into here on maintenance of effort and equity. We don't really have any particular concerns around this because our school funding has been sort of level. We are not seeing the same kinds of holes that other states are seeing. There's also a set of spending mandates for the Agency of Education. So ESSER 3 includes $28 million set aside for the Agency of Education. And within that, we have specific spending mandates. Half of that, so 14 million, is that same bucket of learning loss that the SUs and SDs have. We also then have an additional 2.8 million for after school programs, 2.8 million for summer enrichment, and then 7 million that's sort of unmandated that will leave us able to respond to needs in the field. And so before we sort of take a break and do sort of a question and answer period, I'll sort of talk briefly about sort of how is the AOE thinking about particularly ESSER funds. We think of these as one-time funds that should be used in a strategic manner. So what will that look like? It means that you are going to meet your maintenance of effort requirements for your other federal funds. You're not moving things into ESSER just because it's the easiest thing to do. That you're thinking about maximizing the use of your funds across all of the different funding streams, and that also you're not setting yourself up for a fiscal cliff. And so we can kind of talk about what that means, but not setting up liability that when these funds end, you will then need to sort of come up with a funding source. The fund should be focused on education recovery. That's a pretty basic one, but again, we are well positioned. There's many states where the funds will really have to still be focused on just reopening, just getting kids into classrooms. We are, because of the very hard work that we have done within our schools, and as a state, we are well positioned to actually be thinking longer term about these funds. And the recovery work in education is going to take time. So while we've released ESSER 2, the ESSER 1 application is closed, ESSER 2 has opened. The applications for ESSER 2 are not due until November of this year, and we haven't released the application for ESSER 3. And we want people to be sort of taking a pause and thinking about what they need. At the state level, with the state set-aside funds, which totals about $40 million, the state is interested in maintaining maximum flexibility. We sort of had an immediate response of using the funds to set up some sort of basic communication network. We have used about $3.5 million for the Burlington High School retrofit. And we have identified in the last week to the legislature priorities that we have for some of these funds around things like literacy, facilities, community schools. But we are really waiting to let the recovery planning process take place, to have the needs identified by the schools. No one knows better than the schools what they actually need. And then to see where the agency can support kind of strategic, regional, or multi-district, or even statewide responses. And some of the things that we've identified, particularly with ESSER 3, but also ESSER 2, places that both the agency and our school districts can really be thinking about using their funds strategically, looking at things like school facilities. And there are caveats around that, and I'll share those in a subsequent slide. Looking at supporting integrated service delivery models. So we know that there's been some really intractable historic obstacles to being able to do integrated service models in all of the regions. And then also looking at expanding capacity for remote learning. So what are the ways that we can build that infrastructure? And again, based on the needs that are identified within the field. So with that, I think that's a good place to pause and allow Sue and Sandra to ask some questions.
Thank you, Jill, and hopefully allow you to get a sip of water.
Yeah,
Well, I see you have bulleted for us some of the areas for strategic recovery investment, and I wonder if you might talk about some other ways that school boards can use a strategic systems approach for the best utilization of the funds.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I will signal that I think it's important that school boards are partnering with districts and are really aware of the recovery planning process. That needs assessment is going to be really crucial, and that is imminent, right? It's due April 15th, so you don't have to wait very long to have those conversations. And one of the things that I had signaled around strategic spending, this is where the supplement, not supplant, actually comes in. And this is an important sort of technical detail, but it's a really crucial one. So I talked about not building in liability, right? So some districts have come to us and said, we have really identified that we're going to need, say, a summer enrichment activities coordinator for the next 2 to 3 years, right? It may be that that's a temporary position, right? And it's sort of going to meet the needs of education recovery, and then it goes away. That's a good use of ESSER funds, right? You may also be able to use it somewhere else, but that seems like a good sort of bracketed time frame. However, if you said, we want to really expand our summer or after school programming on a permanent basis. We've always wanted to do the 21C program. We've never been able to sort of get the resources together to do this. Perhaps now is the time that we do that. Because of the supplement, not supplant, one way that a district might use their funds is they could think about hiring that coordinator now with planning for which funding source, which federal funding source is going to take over the cost of that position when, say, ESSER 3 ended in 2024. So because supplement, not supplant does not apply to these ESSER funds, once the program ends, you can actually take that position and move it into a different fund. But you would really need to do some strategic planning around that. You would need to know that you could move it into a different fund. Otherwise, districts may have someone that is really a valuable position within their district, and now they don't have a way to pay for it. So that's some of the strategic planning. Other things that you could look at doing are, we've heard for many years that districts are really, really interested in doing professional development, and yet they've never been able to make time during the day, right? So is there an opportunity now to think beyond just kind of like the immediate COVID context and say, we've always wanted to talk about doing, a different schedule, a different calendar. We wanted to do extended year or extended day, or we've always wanted to add, professional development, but we've never had the resources to do that. One thing that we've sort of all been laughing about is that we're really good at not having enough funds. And so now we have an opportunity. We have all of these funds. So really looking at not sort of these small one-off programs, but are there big intractable problems that we've never been able to bring resources to bear on, the big bucket items that we've always wanted to do that are one-time expenses that we could put some resources towards that could really sort of shift the needle on some of our really big problems. And I think things like integrated service delivery models are another one of those things. We are very aware that there's personnel shortages for many of these services. So is there an opportunity to, address those in a creative way? Is there an opportunity to collaborate with other districts? And that's something that the AOE can help to support. We have identified that as long as they are tracking their expenses separately, that school districts are allowed to sort of share their ESSER funds to get a particular, service, and just keeping the accounting very tight there. That's something the agency can help to support in terms of navigating your way through that. So these are just some of the examples. And then of course there's the facilities example. And facilities, I do have a slide with lots of text on it for reference a little bit later. But the secretary has definitely identified that we have an opportunity here to address some of those longstanding facilities issues. The caveats around that are that you meet all of the regulatory requirements, and I do have that language later, that it needs to fall into the bucket of not necessarily specifically tied to COVID, although that's good. Make that case if you can. Indoor air quality is a really clear one for that. But also creating safe and healthy environments, and also sort of 21st century learning communities. That's another place that investments could be made. And then finally, I will just sort of signal, and again, we'll talk about this sort of at the end of the presentation, that there are many other federal programs. So I'm only touching the ones that are through the Agency of Education. What we don't want is schools building like broadband towers, cell towers, right? There's other programs for that. There's major initiatives that are happening within the state and genuinely will probably be released in the next few days. So how can districts be pulling in all of those resources, whether it's for technology infrastructure, whether it's like integrated supports for families and students. There's lots of programs through Department of Mental Health and other programs. So pulling all of those things together. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on.
Thanks. I thought of a follow-up question. I'm wondering if you are aware of any sort of repository where, as districts are thinking through how they might use a 3 years extension of funds, and they might want to see, is there another district thinking this as well? Is there a place I could collaborate? Will there be information sharing about how districts are approaching this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so our sort of initial response to that need is the coffee and conversations that's happening every Wednesday morning. So we really do see that as a venue where AOE is not talking very much. We're sort of like first few minutes sort of highlighting some key issues. Like in our first coffee and conversations, one issue that very quickly rose to the surface is that districts want more guidance around construction and facilities. So we're going to address that. And we may even do an entire separate webinar on that. So we're going to sort of highlight those initial top level urgent needs and then sort of open it up a little bit for sharing. And the coffee and conversations is open to superintendents and business managers and curriculum coordinators, and it's a really all welcome sort of situation. So that's one place, but I think that you're right that we need to sort of have a formal location for some of these ideas, and we're aware of it and we haven't quite figured out the tool for it yet. It may be Edmodo, maybe actually a good place for that. That's sort of our statewide platform. And I could imagine that we could set up a group where, really anyone that's on like the recovery planning teams could go and sort of workshop ideas. And the agency there wouldn't play sort of a direct role. We might be able to answer questions if they come up. So I can take that back. I think that may be a good solution, a good tool for that.
Thank you.
Collaboration. Yeah, good question.
And I have one follow-up question as well, Jill. You've mentioned supplement, not supplant a couple of times, and I'm not sure that that's a concept that a lot of school board members would be familiar with. So I wondered if you would be able to just elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure thing. And I will signal that I'm a little out on my skis on this one. This is definitely one for our compliance director, which is Cassandra Ryan, but I will give it my best. So usually for our federal funds, we have this requirement called supplement, not supplant. And the idea is that if you say had a program or a staff member that's paid with local funds, and you wanted to do additional work around that program, you could supplement with additional federal funds, but you cannot replace the local funds with the federal funds. So that's what the supplant would be, the supplanting clause. And so this means usually that you can't take federal funds to pay for a local or state funded program. Why ESSER is so unusual is that you can do that. And so there has been the question that's been asked, like, can we use ESSER funds to pay for positions that are usually paid with local dollars? The short answer to that is yes. However, you would really want to be careful about thinking about that strategically, because at some point the ESSER dollars will end and you're going to still want that position and you're going to have to go back and ask for those funds again. That's probably a more challenging political position, rather than finding ways to use ESSER funds for other uses. So that's some of the strategic thinking around it. But the short answer is that yes, you can use ESSER to supplant locally funded or state funded programs with, usually that's not even a possibility, but it is with ESSER. That's my short answer to it, the non-technical answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions for this section? Okay. The last section of the presentation is briefer. Thank you all for bearing with me. And it's looking at some of our other federal programs for awareness, and then sort of wrapping all the way around to the end where we're going to kind of tie it up and talk about how we can think about these other programs. So very briefly, I'll talk about GEAR. This is almost more of a review, but the GEAR funds, again, go through the governor's office. They are for priorities as determined by the governor's office. The first round of GEAR funds, which was GEAR 1, the Agency of Education is administering, and those funds were specifically targeted for our CTE centers. GEAR EANS is the program that is replacing equitable services in ESSER 2 and 3. It's run through the Agency of Education, and it's for support, not direct funding, but support for our approved and recognized independent schools. So this is just a summary slide there. All 17 CTE centers have approved grant awards. They've used them very creatively to be able to continue sort of the hands-on instruction that's so important to CTE education. So that's been actually very successful. We have identified that they still have need, though. So that may be something that the governor with GEAR 2 is going to support, or there may be a different need that's prioritized. So here's our GEAR 2, and again, the governor's waiting to allocate those. This is the overview of GEAR EANS. I've sort of spoken about it extensively at this point. I did include the allocation formula here. So the way that this worked is that we did an intent to, we sort of put out the programmatic information. This is what you need to be eligible. We asked that schools that were interested in applying do an intent to apply. And then once we had that, which was about 60 plus, we generated the allocation formula from that. So it's not a competitive grant. It's based on an allocation formula that has additional targeting for low-income students. And the way that the program is working is that it's a combination of sort of a reimbursement for costs incurred and then state level procurement, where the Agency of Education will be partnering with these schools as they identify their needs to get them the support that they need. And then GEAR 2 is additional funds, no reimbursement, only procurement. And we're still waiting to hear more about that. I did also want to signal the FEMA discussion. And this is a brief slide. I happen to be the person who does FEMA at the Agency of Education. And so I just wanted to sort of make school boards aware that this is something that may become an option very soon. There was a big conversation around FEMA this summer. And there was at one point discussion that the CRF, the coronavirus relief funds, may be tied to applications for FEMA. But under the Trump administration in early September, FEMA definitively made schools ineligible for FEMA reimbursement, with very, very small exceptions. And so we sort of tabled that discussion. Then with the Biden administration in early January, they ordered FEMA to expand eligibility in Category B, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, to include schools in order to provide for safe reopening and operation of eligible schools and childcare facilities. This is not backward looking, so it would be from the date of the memo. And as of right now, it goes only through September 30th of this year. That may change, but that's sort of the current situation. Eligible costs may include, you see I put that in italics because we do not have enough information around this, but PPE, disinfecting supplies and services, and potentially COVID testing. Since the date of that memo, FEMA has not provided any additional guidance, and so that's why AOE has not provided any additional information. We are all waiting to hear what FEMA is going to do. Because of the CRF application discussion back in summer, all LEAs actually completed, our school districts completed their initial eligibility application. So they're all now in the FEMA system. The actual application itself is a whole other ball of wax. But once we get more information, we will be sharing it. I have check-ins weekly on this, and the needle never seems to move. But one thing to sort of signal and think about here is particularly around COVID testing. We are sort of wrapping up our school surveillance testing of teachers and staff, and there have been questions around testing of students, maybe as a need moving forward. You're going to see the state make a decision point on this very, very soon. And depending on what that is, it may be that schools may decide to do student testing, COVID testing. So that's sort of a very vague statement, but it's just something I want to signal that FEMA is potentially something that will be available in the future. All right, and then very briefly, just a quick summary of CRF, because I've already sort of talked about this. These programs already ended. We ran 5 programs. One was to the school districts. One was summer food service program, and that just ran for 3 months. A third was the indoor air quality, that's the Efficiency Vermont one, for HVAC systems. We also ran a program for approved independent schools that was based on a per pupil allocation. And then we also ran a child nutrition equipment grant, and that's the only one that was extended through April because of supply chain issues. These were not competitive grants and they weren't formula grants. We essentially, with the exception of the independent schools, like I set that one aside, we essentially said, tell us what you need and we will give it to you. So it ended up being, you know, tens of millions of dollars that we were able to provide very quickly in support. And school districts really used these funds for their like emergency right-away response. And that's sort of what we cued them in to do, and to sort of use their ESSER funds for other uses as well. So this is just sort of the brief summary. And this is the indoor air quality grant. I have some very nice statistics here that were provided by Efficiency Vermont. We've partnered really, really closely with them. I speak to them probably 2 or 3 times a week right now. And this is the status of the extension of this program. The Agency of Education back in December identified that we wanted this $15 million in unused CRF LEA funds to go to the continuation of this program, and Efficiency Vermont, we sort of partnered on that recommendation. Since then, it has, and it needs to be reauthorized through the legislature. So it ended up being tacked into the H315 bill, which is this COVID relief bill. And unfortunately, that bill hasn't passed yet. So it's currently sitting in the General Assembly, I'm told daily, but it will be voted on very soon. And until the authorization goes through, we cannot start the program again. It may be the case that the funding source for this moves from CRF, which ends in December, to the American Rescue Plan Act that's set aside for the state. So completely separate from any education funding. If that happens, it will actually extend the length of the program, and that will be really, really helpful. So we sort of requested that. But that's sort of the state of this particular one. And it is challenging because we know many, many districts want to get rolling on HVAC projects that they've identified. They've sort of done all the work, they're shovel ready. I've heard from a lot of independent schools that have the same issue. So we are sort of having to be patient on this. But as I said, I'm constantly in contact with Efficiency Vermont, and we've been talking about how to, you know, get this out the doors as soon as we possibly can. So that's the status on this one. And we are hearing from folks all the time. It is possible to use your ESSER funds for indoor air quality projects. However, here comes my facility slide, which I've warned is very large. So this is the specific language for ESSER allowable costs, and this comes from the federal government. So this is sort of our foundation for what's allowable. So it is inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, and upgrade to projects to improve indoor air quality in school facilities. So including mechanical and non-mechanical air conditioning systems, there's a whole host of things that fall under there. Here's the asterisk, the exclamation point. However, because we are moving from CRF funds, which came from US Treasury and went through the legislature and had a very particular set of requirements around them, to US Department of Education, all of the regular regulatory functions and monitoring functions and procurement, all of that is back in place. So things like Davis-Bacon around wages, things around procurement and bidding, right? All of that is back in place. There's sort of restrictions around like emergency procurement, which was built into the previous program. It is really important to signal that all construction projects must be approved by the AOE prior to bidding. That's really, really important. And so I have the contact information for Josh Soulier, and he's working with Cassandra Ryan. And we are, as I said, we've identified that construction is an area where districts need additional guidance. We have guidance documents and like an office hours session coming out very soon. But some other examples of construction projects that we've seen come up from the field is things like refurbishing spaces to accommodate more students to meet distancing guidelines. And also I will signal that the major revision to the health guidance is coming out most likely today, if not Thursday at the latest. And so once districts have that information, they will be able to make much clearer decisions about what their space needs to look like. So refurbishing, adding on additional space, outdoor tents, leasing of spaces, this all falls under ESSER. And then also assessing and addressing maintenance needs for upgrades to mitigate exposure to environmental hazards. So that's a non-COVID need, but it's part of that safe and healthy environment. So again, these are uses of ESSER. These are good strategic uses of ESSER. And we're also signaling that in the Biden administration's infrastructure plan, which was just released, the American Jobs Plan, there is significant funding for infrastructure projects and school facilities. In addition, there's broadband programs that are in the works right now. The governor's office is going to be releasing information about sort of a statewide approach to this. So there's a lot of different strands, and the agency is looking to, one of our proposals to the legislature was for a contract for an expert, subject matter expert, to help support districts in doing facilities projects. So we're really looking at this as a good strategic use of funds, and we're trying to build the structure and guidance and support that districts will need to be able to do this effectively. And as I signaled, there are many other federal programs. So this is just a sample. One thing that I actually have is on my to-do list is trying to come up with sort of a resource sheet of like an annotated bibliography of all of the different funding sources, short description, and who is the contact. It's a bit of a job, so I'm working on that. But these are some of the ones that, you know, school boards should be aware of, districts should certainly be aware of. Like, these are other sources of support, not just for the schools, but for families and communities. And so being really aware of these. One thing I will really point to is the internet and broadband access supports that are currently available. And so these two documents that I've linked here, particularly the broadbands and supports and resources for families. If you have students or you have families that are trying to do remote learning and they do not have enough internet access, these are resources that are currently available. There's dozens of them. So we really want to make sure that this information is, you know, in the hands of the school board, it's in the hands of the families, it's in the hands of the districts, so that they're able to offer these supports. ESSER is not the only game in town, right? There are more immediate and sort of effective ways to provide this support. There's also childcare block grants for essential workers, stabilization grants for providers, and there's been an expansion of the SAMHSA grant through Department of Mental Health. So as I said, the agency is working with Department of Mental Health around mental health supports. But, you know, again, for school boards to be aware of and districts to be aware of that these programs exist. And then the last couple of slides are just points of contact. Again, I'll share these slides with Sue and Sandra to share out to school boards. These are the folks that you get in touch with. And I will say that you know, I'm your gal. If you have any questions around federal emergency funds, you can always send them to me and I can either answer them or direct you to the folks who can. So these are kind of the points of contact. And here are some links to helpful resources. So we have built a pretty extensive web page on the Agency of Education. There's a hub page, that's the bottom link here, and it then links to all of the different funding programs with information about each one, key dates, amounts, restrictions, guidance, FAQs, the whole 9 yards. The CCSSO, which is a chief state, oh goodness, I cannot break that one down. But they are a nationwide organization, has a very handy dandy comparison chart for COVID-19 relief funding that breaks down each relief bill. There's also the COVID-19 Federal Emergency Funds webpage, which I've already signaled, the recovery page, which has resources around recovery planning. And then that very big document that I said was sort of the toolkit to use for strategic planning, which is the Federal Education Funding Planning Guidance document. So all of these will be available for folks. And with that, I can stop the sharing and open up for questions.
So Jill, I was going to ask you a question about other ways that school boards or other programs that school boards should be aware of when they're investigating all of their different needs. But I think you've covered that in your presentation. It would be so helpful, I think, for if you ever have the time to develop the resource sheet that you spoke about, to have all of that in one place, because it's can be a challenge to know where to look for all of those programs.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a challenge for me. It's a challenge within the agency and apparently within the state, because I did actually reach out to a bunch of different state stakeholders and everybody said, I don't know, we don't have that. So yeah, I agree. I think it's something that would be really, really important as a resource for kind of everyone to have. It's high on my to-do list. So as soon as I have that information and I can put that together, I will get that out to the field and get that out to folks. But I think that my message here to the School Board Association is you know, just to be aware that, you know, as families or, you know, schools or families are identifying a need, most likely there's probably a program to support it. You know, we've had really extensive federal programs come through to respond to the pandemic. And so particularly for those needs that are like very immediate for families, things like, you know, rental assistance and like heating costs and internet costs, those programs exist. And so, you know, at the agency level, I'm going to do my best. It's a me project. I'm going to do my best to try to pull that together and get that out. But I think just that awareness that those programs are out there is really important, so that school boards know that they don't have to just go through the district, you know, that they can collaborate and say, hey, you know, we don't have to wait for ESSER like that, you know. T-Mobile 1 million is getting internet and mobile hotspots out to families every single day. You know, there's also right now there's an emergency broadband where there's a team that's coming into the state of Vermont through mid-April, and they will set up hotspots, you know, around schools or around libraries. And we've put out communication around that to superintendents. But of course, you know, they're really busy right now. So that is one of the ones that I linked in this presentation. You know, if we can identify needs within our communities where we can set up those hotspots, you know, let's do that. So that's sort of like, we can, as a state, we can sort of put that together, but also I would encourage boards to be resourceful as well and know that there probably is a program out there for them.
Thank you so much for putting together this presentation for school boards. We'll be following it up with an email to our members that will include a link to this video and also some of the resources that you mentioned in your slides, along with a chart with the ESSER allocations in it. And we really look forward to partnering with you in the future as more information becomes available to be able to provide it out statewide. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to get this information out there. I think that if we all have sort of a base level consistent understanding of what's available, what are the basic parameters, and how we can all really be thinking about, you know, opportunities to really do something with these funds in a way that we will probably hopefully never have the opportunity to do again. You know, and get sort of everybody moving in that direction. I think that's so valuable. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and please send me any questions.
Thank you, Jill.
All right, thank you.